All right, so we're going to go ahead and kick off this panel discussion. My name is Dr. Robyn Adams. I am an assistant professor at a school in Texas that I will not name because they are not doing me right. I currently serve as the activist scholar in residence at Southwestern University, funded by the Mellon Foundation. The last person to have a fellowship like this at the school was Bell Hooks, so I stand in the legacy. And so today we have another panel for you all, Pathways to Reproductive Justice Futurisms, Encountering Reproductive Dystopias. We have a wonderful group of panelists here. We have 5. This is very rare here because it's usually a packed house. So everybody will get 10 to 11 minutes to speak. Yes, look, no rushing, okay? I will put that 1-minute sign up at 9 minutes, but no, you have a little grace period because y'all don't listen to the 1-minute sign anyways. First we have Dr. Rajani Bhatia, Dr. Katie Hasson, Dr. Alison Kafer, Dr. Grace Gow, and Dr. Carly Thomsen. We're gonna go in order that is listed on the program. Started with Dr. Rajani Bhatia first. So thank you all. Give it up before people start.
So we can hear you.
Can you all hear me? All right, great. First of all, thank you so much to all the organizers. I am honored to be here, and I just want to thank a number of people in the room whose ideas are, I've based this on. I've co-collaborators from decades past, Marlene Freed, Loretta Ross, and of course, Ann Hendrickson, whose actual words appear in here in some places. So thank you very much. All right, so let me just start by saying that Broligarchs are population alarmists, just like Malthusians. So for those of us in the RJ community who are familiar with the Malthusianism that long undergirded population control, I'll begin with some comparisons. So liberal, technocratic frames of international population control that began in the middle of the 20th century, they relied on the notion that resources are scarce and threatened by overpopulation. There were too many people and not enough resources. And it's motivated by a vision of the future that is dystopic, an imploding and overburdened Earth. The solution was seen to be population control, which aimed to reduce the global population size by technocratic means. It took place through a development paradigm that viewed population size as a major cause of poverty, and it was funded by large-scale philanthropy, most recently the Gates Foundation, and state aid agencies such as USAID invested in the development and promotion of contraception and sterilization. A lot of these programs were pitched as voluntary, but many were associated with coercion and the use of targets to reduce fertility, often at the cost of basic health care provision and in disregard of reproductive rights. So hopefully we all know that story. So new technocratic frames of population control, on the other hand, have been accompanied by the gutting of USAID, and in the news, we see images of stored contraceptives slated for incineration abroad. We've moved from an era of scarcity to visions of a techno-utopia that involves engineering a post-human and post-scarcity stage of evolution. An AGI future of enhanced humans and abundance that involves colonizing space. We've moved away from a paradigm of international development to rely on effective altruism, from large-scale international and state aid to the whims of individual venture capitalists. We've moved from fears of global overpopulation to global underpopulation because a critical mass of people, we are now told, brings progress rather than inhibits it. Jeffrey Epstein is the quintessential Broligarch who pursued transhumanism. Transhumanism was originally conceptualized by early eugenicists like Julian Huxley, but developed during a second wave in the 1990s. The idea is not merely to improve the quality of human genetic stock by weeding out presumed inferior people or promoting the reproduction of those deemed superior. Rather, transhumanism aims to transcend that stock altogether through enhancement into a post-human, super-intelligent form. Like other Broligarchs, Epstein was also interested in cryonics, a method of freezing bodies and brains in the hopes they might be revived in the future. He desired to seed the human race with his DNA by impregnating women at his vast New Mexico ranch, as documented by the New York Times back in 2019. His plan, according to 2 scientists and 1 advisor to whom he confided, was to have 20 women at a time impregnated with his sperm at that Santa Fe ranch. He gave money to the program for evolutionary dynamics at Harvard and to the World Transhumanist Association, now Humanity Plus. According to a cognitive psychologist who attended the events in which Epstein feted scientists, Epstein echoed classic Malthusianism by critiquing programs that assist the poor in any way, as they only wind up fueling the poor's so-called natural impulse to overpopulate. Epstein's contemporaries, like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, take only a slightly different tack, as they are preoccupied with underpopulation. Their visions of population collapse are also animated by effective altruism and long-termism. In abbreviated definition, effective altruism is a utilitarian approach to philanthropy and doing good for the most people possible, and relatedly, long-termism is the idea that we should act today according to the needs of as yet unborn people living in a distant future, rather than fulfill the short-term needs of the current population. The Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, which was made to close in 2024, but there are others like the Global Priorities Institute, they spurned these ideologies. And they were funded in part by Elon Musk, and its director, Nick Bostrom, used to be a member of the Extropians, which is a libertarian strain of transhumanism. In the 90s, Bostrom posted emails to an Extropian listserv that articulated a preoccupation with high IQ correlating to low fertility. More recently, Nick Bostrom has projected a long-term future with a 10 followed by 58 zeros sized population of cognitively enhanced digital posthumans, which he fears will not come about if humans go extinct. So there's the rub. To make it to that future, at least some people will have to survive today's existential threats, whether they be the climate crisis or asteroid strikes or even an AI apocalypse, which we could encounter en route to the utopia. So long as there are, in the words of one long-termist, enough survivors on Earth in close contact to form a viable reproductive population with room to spare, and they should have a sustainable food supply, so long as that's true, there's still a chance of reaching the stars someday. Venture capitalist Balaji Srinivasan explained it this way: we will need more humans to withstand future shocks that will inevitably accompany the quest to colonize Mars, as people will die in the process. The long-termist foundation, Longview Philanthropy, seeded the Population Wellbeing Initiative at UT Austin, which then received a $10 million grant from Elon Musk. Its demographers, Dean Spears and Mike Caruso, released their new book, After the Spike, Population Progress and the Case for People, last year on World Population Day. In it, they claim that humanity is 4/5 over, and that after peaking later this century, the global population will rapidly decline to 0. As feminist scholar Emily Merchant explains, for long-termists, including Spears and Caruso, potential people, that is, people who may exist in the future but as yet have been neither conceived nor conceived of, have the same moral status as actually existing people who are currently living and breathing. Creating a life in the future is thus morally equivalent to saving a life now. This means we might have to sacrifice lives today for the sake of those that might survive into the future. This utilitarian approach also animates long-termist William McCaskill, who in his book, What We Owe the Future, worries that human population decline will lead to stagnation and calls for having more babies. Peter Thiel's contribution is through his investment in a technocratic element, the Menstrual Cycle App 28, to promote fertility awareness over contraception. To sum up, while Malthusians are preoccupied with the number of humans relative to available resources, Malthus's classic example was the ratio of humans to food. For Broligarchs, human bodies and minds are the resource, the food, if you will, that is necessary for the development of the techno-utopia for the tech elite. As the dominant narrative of population reverses, feminist critiques of population control that undergird RJ theorizing remain deeply resonant. The coexistence of over and underpopulation panics today is one of the clearest signs that they do not reflect neutral concern about numbers as much as ideological projects about power. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. We're going to have to sit with that a bit. Thank you, Dr. Rajani. We're now going to have Dr. Katie Hasson speak.
Thanks. Thanks so much, everyone. It's really wonderful to be back here, and I'm honored, along with the others, to be participating in the think tank convening again this year. So last year at our inaugural think tank convening, I presented on 3 reproductive and genetic technologies currently available or on the horizon that raise the stakes for reproductive justice. And those were polygenic screening of embryos, heritable genome editing of embryos, right, actually changing their DNA, and the creation of lab-made gametes. And I unpacked some of the assumptions underlying their development and the narratives promoting their use. And here I should stop and introduce myself, which I forgot. Katie Hasson, I'm the executive director of the Center for Genetics and Society. And we focus on bringing social justice and human rights perspectives on these kinds of reproductive and genetic technologies into the forefront of conversations about it. So it's part of my role is to bring both updates on the developments and new perspectives on these technologies into the conversation. So last year I was highlighting the rapid emergence of a 2-track society where many have their reproductive decisions and autonomy severely curtailed, while a select few are offered ever more fine-grained control over every aspect of reproduction and of their future offspring. And 1 year later, it's a bit shocking how quickly things have developed, mainly on the market side of things, right? So you heard earlier about the company Nucleus. You may have even seen their ads plastered all over the New York City subway with the message, have your best baby, have a taller baby, have a smarter baby. Nucleus is one of the latest startups selling this technology of pre-implantation genetic testing for polygenic traits, so for things that are influenced by the interaction of multiple genes. And shorthand for it is polygenic embryo screening. So these are companies like Orchid, Genomic Prediction, Harasite. At least 2 of those companies are founded by former Thiel fellows, so Thiel's name will come up quite a lot. These tests are offered to those who are going through IVF as an add-on, right? You take a few cells from each of the embryos that are created, you do genetic testing, and then you run them through proprietary algorithms that can be used to score or rank them on their probabilities of developing a wide range of health conditions, traits, right, that are correlated with small differences in thousands of locations across the genome. And this includes claims from some of these companies about screening for height, for IQ, for personality traits, and things like this. These predictions offer a false promise, right, an illusion of control based on dubious science that reinforces genetic determinism and beliefs about supposedly superior and inferior genes, right? We've talked earlier about the clear parallels to early 20th century, better babies contests and aspects of so-called positive eugenics. The growth in this market is being driven by big investments from Silicon Valley venture capitalists, right? Familiar names like Peter Thiel, I already mentioned, Sam Altman, right, from OpenAI, Brian Armstrong, who's a cryptocurrency CEO, Anne Wojcicki from 23andMe, And Alexis Ohanian, he's one of the main investors in Nucleus. He's the Reddit co-founder, also known as Mr. Serena Williams. So, and these technologies count Elon Musk among prominent users, right, who are using it in conceiving children. And this is also happening in the context of private equity firms rapidly buying up and consolidating fertility clinics over the past 10 years in the US. And these private equity affiliated fertility practices tend to be in wealthier geographic areas, and they tend to provide different services, including really promoting this kind of pre-implantation genetic testing. So we can see the way that these market changes are influencing the technologies that are made available and promoted. And these financial investments are also paired with ideological investments of the Broligarchs, as Rajani was just saying, right? The financial investments in these companies align with Silicon Valley's new strain of pronatalism, right? This word that's come up a lot, a professed concern about shrinking birth rates, and a belief that not only more, but better babies are the solution, right? And here we can look at the couple Simone and Malcolm Collins. They've been in the news many times, a couple with strong ties to Silicon Valley, who've become a poster family for pronatalism. And also, right, they've referred to themselves as hipster eugenicists. Their version of pronatalism promotes that the best people should have as many children as possible, and that these children should be genetically optimized, right? And to give you a sense of the broader, right, political project or the vision of the future, right? These are some quotes from them in a profile in The Guardian from 2024. They said, it's easy to forget how small the population in the world who actually impacts anything or matters is. And then they say, you know, when we talk to reporters, we're very, pronatalism, it isn't just for the elites. But in truth, we do target the elites, haha, unfortunately, right? So the Collins' form of pronatalism is part of an agenda that's explicitly designed to transform the current socioeconomic elite into what they see as a future biological elite, right? That is the, you know, reproductive futurism that they have in mind. And I'm glad that you, well, I'm not glad, but I was also going to mention Epstein here, right? Not directly connected to this couple necessarily, but you know, we can keep in mind the revelations from the Epstein files about his obsession with eugenics, transhumanism, and plans to seed the human race with his own supposedly superior DNA. So these pro-tech pronatalists continue to race ahead with the Silicon Valley-funded attempts to develop technologies and build a market for what they see as optimizing both reproduction and the resulting children. And these investments don't stop at the genetic testing or the selection of embryos, but gene editing of embryos is potentially on offer as well, right? The proposal that we would use CRISPR or other tools to alter the DNA of early embryos or eggs or sperm in order to produce a genetically modified baby with desired traits. And this is the area where we've seen the most changes in the past year, right? There have been rapid moves to commercialize this technology. It's risky, speculative, and actually currently prohibited in all countries that have laws about it. But multiple startups have been founded in 2025 that plan to offer in the future gene editing of embryos, right? Companies called Bootstrap Bio, Manhattan Genomics, which was initially called the Manhattan Project, and Preventive. There are big overlaps in the investors, right? Sam Altman, Brian Armstrong, and some of the founders are also shared across some of these companies. And it's shocking, really, because there's been a long-standing consensus among many scientists, bioethicists, civil society, and others that heritable genome editing should not be used at this time and, you know, never for many people, right? But really, no one thinks it should be going forward at this point. And it is actually, as I said, prohibited in over 70 countries, including the United States, right? But this is not deterring the so-called tech titans. They have plans either that the laws will change because they don't like them, or that they'll circumvent them, right? Mainly by exporting their experiments to other countries where laws may be less likely or there's less ability to enforce prohibitions. United Arab Emirates has previously been floated as a possibility by the company Preventive. There's also this Prospera. I don't know if people have heard of Prospera. It's a libertarian city-state in Honduras designed with few regulations in order to attract biotech business, right? It's already been home to several supposed clinical trials for gene therapy enhancements of adults, right? So this convergence of technologies is something that I really want to talk about, particularly as it's happening in the market. Polygenic embryo screening and heritable genome editing are two parts of what the cryptocurrency billionaire Brian Armstrong has dubbed, via X, of course, the Gattaca stack, right? Referencing both the film Gattaca and a sort of software engineering term for the stack of technologies that work together. I'm at 10 minutes, okay. So his view is that these technologies, including the creation of gametes, embryo testing, embryo editing, and artificial wombs, could be used to help with the decline in birth rates and accelerate evolution, right? These projects are tied together. This is especially concerning for so many reasons. The convergence of the technologies, the involvement of Silicon Valley wealth and values that are driving the endeavor, the rapid move to the market in the unregulated fertility industry, the willingness to openly flout the rules, and also the ideological concerns around revival of eugenics, the element of explicit population engineering, and the way that it works through the market, right? So it's really important to trace how eugenic influences are ongoing, particularly in science, to push back against elites' ambitions to shape the universe in their image through the development and use of these technologies with the power to potentially change what it means to be human. And it's equally important to reimagine reproductive futures, right? Challenge the assumptions and motivations that are currently driving this research and its application, to center marginalized communities' wisdom and priorities for the present and the future, and reshape how these technologies are marketed and used or not used, right? Reproductive technologies potentially have impacts on health equity, equity more broadly, far into the future. We can ensure that they're guided by equity and justice, build a future where all lives are valued, or risk that they'll be shaped by eugenics, white supremacy, and profit, embedding inequities in biology and society for generations to come. Thanks.
So from what I'm hearing is that we need to take these tech billionaires out. All right. Okay. I didn't say it, they said it. So next we have my Texas comrade, Dr. Alison Kafer. Yeah, give it up.
Is this mic working? Okay.
You just got to bring it very close.
Okay, I'll bring it very close. Hi, everybody. My name is Alison Kafer. I'm an associate professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and the director of LGBTQ studies at UT Austin. Even under the best of circumstances, I would be really happy to be here with all of these people whose work has been so important to me. But as Dr. Adams suggested, right now with the recently announced closure of gender studies and ethnic studies departments across the state of Texas, and new restrictions on controversial topics in our classrooms, I'm just really grateful to be here with people loudly and proudly doing the work. So that's a way of saying thank you for including me and inviting me here. I want to start with one of the questions that we were asked to address. What futures are we imagining? And as we all know, bound up in that question are questions about whose futures we are imagining. And even more than that, whose imaginings do we listen to? One of the through lines of my work is the way that disabled people are often presumed to be the future of no future. The future no one wants, the future to ward against, the future that signals only dystopia and despair. Imagined futures, ideas of better futures, have long been sites of ableist erasure. Ongoing histories of eugenics, the continued positioning of disability and disabled people as a problem to be solved through technological innovation, healthcare as a site of surveillance and policing. Within this ableist worldview, disabled people function more as figures of imagination than as real, complex people. So that even when disability activists, artists, scholars, and community members imagine otherwise, the only futures that register in larger public discourse are those of elimination. Against that backdrop, fostering crip futurities and more just futures for disabled people and making room for the imaginings of disabled people is an essential part of the RJ project. I'll say more about the kinds of futures disability communities are imagining in a minute. But first, I want to highlight two guiding principles that might help us get closer to the futures we envision. The first is to recognize that disability is an integral category and method of analysis for RJ work. This means not simply including disabled people in our analyses, although it does mean that, but also looking at how ideas about ability or inability are used to justify interventions in people's sexual and reproductive lives. So in the context of RJ, this means looking at how attributions of incapacity, deficiency, incompetency, disease, illness, and dependency are used not only to control and manage people's reproduction, but to understand such management as common sense, benign, and apolitical. In other words, recognizing disability as a method of analysis makes room for understanding how ableism affects everyone, not just those with Western biomedical diagnoses. But as disability justice activists insist, everyone may be impacted by ableism, but we are not impacted equally. Disability justice principles such as intersectionality, anti-capitalist politics, cross-movement and cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, call for attention to these differential stratified effects. And we can think about reproductive ableism as the way that ableism intertwines with racism, classism, sexism, and settler colonialism to support the reproductive management of devalued groups. So I want to just briefly mention a couple of forms of this reproductive ableism. The fact that most states in this country still allow for the termination of parental rights on the basis of disability, and that such terminations seem to be on the rise, especially for Black and Indigenous families and for parents with mental disabilities. The fact that most states still allow for the forced sterilization of disabled people, and although they require some kind of court order or review, there are numerous cases that suggest such reviews are far from robust, and again, that as long as such procedures are framed as treatment, they are seen not as violations of one's reproductive autonomy, but merely as medicine. And as many people have mentioned today, the widespread use of reproductive technologies to screen out or deselect for disability. The second guiding principle is that there is a long history of disability justice activism in support of reproductive health, rights, and justice. So again, this isn't just about including disabled people in our work, but looking at the activist strategies and prefigurative politics put forward by disability movements. Our knowledge of these histories is increasingly important as we fight the continued co-optation of disability rights and justice rhetoric by fascist anti-RJ forces. I'm thinking, for example, of right-wing movements deploying sentimentalized images of disabled people, especially white children with Down syndrome, to argue in favor of abortion bans, while simultaneously gutting needed social services and public education for disabled children and adults. This move has been very successful in the United States, as we all know. But a few months ago, I met with activists from Europe and Australia who told me that the same campaigns are ramping up there. As Jalicia noted this morning, we need to be building transnational networks of support and resistance. Or to take another example, the way some states are including a so-called disability exception in their trans bathroom bans as a way of undoing or foreclosing trans disability solidarities around bathroom access. Or the way proponents of fetal personhood mobilize disability language around guardianship and vulnerability to enshrine such personhood into law. I could go on, but I'll stop. I want to close instead with a few examples of crip world making, of disabled people imagining otherwise, especially when it comes to reproductive futures and kinship imaginaries. So I'm thinking of disability historians such as Jennifer Barclay, Susan Birch, and Sarah Witt, who are uncovering histories of care networks among disabled enslaved people and indigenous people placed in settler boarding schools. So people, in other words, who insisted upon remaining in relation with disabled people, even in the face of extreme violence. Contemporary organizations such as Through the Looking Glass that design and create adaptive equipment so that people with disabilities can parent their children, and who are using theoretical concepts that were developed within disability communities, such as crip time, as a way of explaining how, for example, changing diapers more slowly because of one's disability can open up extended possibilities for touch and care. I'm thinking of activist Alice Wong's collaboration with artist Finnegan Shannon. They created a series of interactive posters on what they called the disabled rage, necessary to respond to the big, beautiful bill's decimation of Medicaid, the ongoing debilitation and reprocide of people in Palestine, the separation and detention of families by ICE, and the removal of care from trans and unhoused people, all RJ and disability justice issues. Alice Wong also created a disabled oracle society, insisting upon the continuation of disabled people into the future. Artist Carolyn Lazard, deeply aware of how medical settings have been sites of anti-Black and ableist violence, has created a series of artworks reimagining doctors' waiting rooms as spaces of connection and kin-making between and among patients. Writer Julieta Singh has similarly talked about forging kinship on the shared basis of being denied medical care. Writers such as Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samarasinghe, Stacey Park Milburn, and Moya Bailey have all written about the world-making possibilities of disability doulas, disabled people ushering other disabled people into community and mutual aid networks, suggesting alternate modes of mothering, birthing, and family formation beyond the biological. And finally, artist Sandy Yee, who has designed and sewn onesies that fit infants with different bodies, babies born with one leg or a shorter arm, so that disabled people can understand themselves as anticipated and desired members of their families. How might our future shift if we make more room for these kinds of imaginings in our visions, or these disabled dreamers? These are all, in Crystal's language from this morning, erotic orientations to the future. Language that I want to close with and underscore, given how rarely eros is mentioned in relation to disabled people. We need more disabled erotic futures. Thank you.
Hello. As you see, everything is bigger and better in Texas. Thank you. That was wonderful. Next on our list, We have, oh, hallelujah. We're actually gonna go with Grace Gal first before we're going to California. But you know, people in California been coming to Texas and really getting the state together. Yeah. All right, so we'll move it over to Grace Gal. Thank you.
And can I use
Absolutely.
it'll be easier. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I want to start by thanking Jalicia Jolly and Loretta Ross for inviting me to be on the planning team again as a speaker again. Emily and Carrie, there was a lot of herding of cats and a lot of papers that we had to sign. So thank you for that. So I'm Grace Gal from Southern California. I'm an ethicist at Claremont School of Theology. So I'll start by just a few words from last year. When I was 41, a decade ago, I gave birth to my friend's, older friend's baby girl as their altruistic gestational surrogate after they had been struggling with infertility for 10 years. So when I later published a book about those and other people's experiences while approaching surrogacy from a progressive Christian perspective as a form of reproductive hospitality and solidarity when done well, I considered the ethics of the practice alongside its main alternative, which was, for Christians, formal or informal adoption. Now, since then, a newer assisted reproductive technology has emerged, uterine transplantation. While still a third repro tech, ectogenesis, or artificial wombs, I was glad to hear Katie reference that, seems like it's more science fiction than real. Successful breakthroughs on fetal lambs surviving for weeks in biobags, as they've been called, portend an extension to human fetuses in the not too distant future. So, I'm going to submit to you all today that if we are considering gestation by other means, which is the title of my talk, in reproductive justice futurism, there is wisdom in considering all three practices in tandem. Okay, so let me just quickly first unpack uterus transplants. Since the first successful case in Sweden in 2014, there's been at least 80 live births from roughly 100 uterine transplants worldwide, with the first live birth in the US taking place outside of a clinical trial in 2023. Uterus transplantations, and I'll refer to it as UTX, is designed as a possible fertility treatment for the approximately 1 in 500 women with absolute uterine factor infertility. So this group includes those with MRKH who were born with female anatomy but without a uterus, and others who have had hysterectomies. It's a major undertaking. The recipient of a uterus surgically removed from a suitable donor must first take immunosuppressive drugs. Post-transplantation, once menstruation begins and healing is complete, and that could take a full year, an IVF-created embryo will be transferred. And here to note, IVF is necessary because the transplanted uterus won't be connected to the recipient's fallopian tubes. Assuming successful transplantation and subsequent development, the recipient will later give birth by C-section. And it must be by C-section because the nerves connected to the donor uterus won't be reattached to the recipient's pelvis. So after that birth, or a possible second birth, that uterus will then be surgically removed so the patient can stop immunosuppression. So thus far, it's a big deal, right? It's a big deal. Thus far, most organs for transplantation have come from altruistic living donors, primarily close relatives. So postmenopausal mothers or mothers-in-law to daughters. But they have also come from cadavers. So I'll add that while all recipients in clinical trials have been biological females, several teams across the world are actively working on UTX for trans women. Now, uterus donation from trans men has not been documented. Maybe it's happened, but there aren't reports of it. But according to a 2022 French retrospective survey on trans men's attitudes, 90% said they would have been willing to do UTX, and a 2023 Turkish perspective study found that 84% of Turkish men undergoing hysterectomy showed interest in it. Okay, so now I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm going to quickly pivot to artificial wombs. This is a technology being continually tested and refined on fetal lambs, with the hope someday of using the tech to save babies born extremely prematurely. So in the US, some 30,000 babies each year are born earlier than 26 weeks, and only about half of those survive, and usually with complications of varying degrees. Many of you know in this room that Black women and birthing people have a 50% greater chance of preterm birth compared to their non-Hispanic white counterparts, and 1 in 7 Black infants in the US are born preterm. Okay, so in 2017, researchers at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, so CHOP, they were able to keep alive 8 fetal lambs submerged in transparent Ziploc-looking biobags for 28 days. Basically, they plugged an oxygenator into each lamb's umbilical cord, and that also removed carbon dioxide and supplied nutrients. And each fetal lamb's heart supplied all of the blood, as it would in the womb, and the biobag acted like an amniotic sac filled with warm, sterile, lab-made fluid that the lamb breathed and swallowed. So that was 2017. By 2020, that time had extended from 28 days to 110, with the lamb's gestational age being equivalent to 23 to 24 weeks in humans. Okay. So now in September 2023, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration convened an advisory committee to consider whether to permit the first clinical trials for humans. To be sure, no artificial womb prototype, and there are multiple companies, trying multiple prototypes, none of them are trying to replace natural pregnancy. The experimental fetal lambs that I referenced before, they were taken by C-section from their mother first. But if ectogenesis someday moves from partial to complete, where we have a matrix-like scenario of at least some gestation taking place in pods entirely outside of the human body, this repro-tech could radically reshape how we imagine pregnancy and parenthood, as well as whether and how we will intervene to save life. So again, while the stated hope for ectogenesis is to dramatically increase survival of extreme preemies, we could just as well imagine the tech being used to create reproductive dystopias. For instance, you could easily picture an employer not wanting to grant family leave, but telling their pregnant employees, just use an artificial womb, right? You can imagine the state forcing someone who is seeking an abortion to, okay, fine, you can end your pregnancy, but then we're gonna put your fetus in an artificial womb. Maybe this would be like an updated version of what happened when pregnant, brain-dead Adriana Smith had to endure, what she had to endure in the state of Georgia, when because of the abortion restriction laws, they force her to remain on life support for gestational purposes for several months. So again, we could imagine these dystopias, even if the tech is created ostensibly for good. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to pivot and just ask a series of questions about these three considered in tandem. We can ask, how might a good or decent society set public funding priorities and or eligibility criteria for all three? So to the extent that uterine transplantation involves organs, we can compare it to, let's say, kidneys. And we all know about waiting lists and eligibility and, the ranking system. We can ask, if a parent hopeful were a good candidate for UTX and had access to a uterus, would it be morally wrong for them to pursue gestational surrogacy instead, because they would be outsourcing the medical risks to the third party as opposed to primarily assuming them themselves? We could ask, should a shift from surrogacy to uterus transplants for those who are medically eligible, would we consider that like a step away from the concerns about commodification and exploitation that have rendered commercial surrogacy problematic for many and led to surrogacy being prohibited in several jurisdictions? Or would increasing the popularity of UTX only serve to create new dystopias in fueling underground markets and organ trafficking, now not just of kidneys, but of uteri, right? Might the technological innovation of artificial wombs be the solution public policy experts and lawmakers seek to the growing problem of maternal morbidity and mortality? Or were radical feminists in the 1970s and 80s correct about the dangers of repro tech erasing the role of women and women's bodies, right? We can ask these and so many other questions. Ultimately, I'm just trying to surface how, beyond so-called natural conception, we will continue to reproduce ourselves. ART, as many of you know, has placed parenthood in reach of some classes of persons who might not otherwise be able to reproduce. All these classes. But we all know that the technology remains largely unavailable, inaccessible, and unaffordable to many. My colleagues have raised eugenicist concerns, and we got to figure it out. Thank you.
Hello. Well, that was some great questions that Dr. Gao left us with. Now for our last presenter on the panel, we're going back to Texas. We have Dr. Carly Thomsen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Give it up, come on.
Thanks, everybody. So as others have said on this panel already, I just want to echo that I'm really grateful to be here and to be in conversation with all of you and learning from all of you. Today, my remarks are going to be drawing from a book that I recently finished called Reproductive Justice Queerly, and it'll be out this summer. So I'm going to first just give an overview of the book's arguments and then focus on the insights of one specific chapter that I think aligns well with the demands of the RJ Futures think tank. So in short, my book asks, what does it mean to do reproductive justice queerly? How is it different from thinking about reproductive issues that LGBTQ people might face? I answer these questions by focusing on what we might think of as typical reproductive issues, including surrogacy, paid parental leave, abortion, crisis pregnancy centers, and parenting, and by bringing queer theory to bear on them such that our approaches can better meet the demands of reproductive justice, especially when discourses of queerness are being deployed. So first, the book's arguments. I'm going to share those by drawing from the chapter on surrogacy, and then I'm going to turn to a chapter on gender-neutral language in conversations about abortion. So in the chapter on surrogacy, I consider how gay men couples have become centered in conversations and policy about surrogacy. For decades, Black feminist studies scholars have outlined the exploitative aspects of the commercial surrogacy industry. Recently, however, LGBTQ activists have championed surrogacy, and entire industries have popped up to support gay men's desires for biological children, even calling it fertility equity. I consider this shift from feminist critique to supposedly queer celebration and the place of the figure of the largely wealthy white gay men couple in this shift. By analyzing media articles as one part of the chapter, I show that articles on surrogacy increasingly mention LGBTQ-ness, and further, that when LGBTQ-ness is invoked, the article is less likely to use the word surrogate and more likely to have a positive tone. Put more directly then, surrogates themselves are rarely mentioned in media coverage of surrogacy, and this problem is exacerbated when LGBTQ-ness is invoked. By contrast, when an article uses the word feminist, surrogates are far more likely to be mentioned. This brief discussion illustrates one of the three interrelated arguments of my book. That is, first, conversations about reproductive justice that deploy the language of queerness often call up the LGBTQ person as a way to index progressive politics, making it difficult to see that what people are asking for is typically quite conservative, even reproducing the very racism, classism, and sexism that reproductive justice scholars and activists have long worked against. Second, often these discussions center men, usually gay and sometimes trans, and we ought to consider what it means, especially in this political moment, that the centering of men in reproductive justice conversations is what is allowing them to be framed as queer. Third, these conversations often focus on discursive inclusion, ignoring what it would take to create material change in the world. Reproductive justice queerly is a critical response, then, to the increased discourses in circulation that tether LGBTQ-ness to reproduction. It asks us to bring the two together anew so that what we are arguing for can become far queerer than what is on offer in this moment. By way of discussing this relationship between discourse and materiality, I now want to turn to the chapter on scholars and advocates' move toward using so-called gender-neutral language in conversations about abortion. So that is talking solely about pregnant people, patients, birthers, and so on. The impulse here is admirable, to create a world that is more inclusive to LGBTQ people. But this impulse is being carried out in ways that ought to encourage us to pause. I want to be clear up front about something. I do not believe that reproductive justice advocacy should only focus on women, or that the reproductive health, rights, and justice concerns of trans and other gender nonconforming people should be outside of the bounds of our work to create a reproductively just world. Rather, what I'm arguing is that supporters of RJ need to do more to address trans health, rights, and justice. Data on trans health make clear why we need this shift. In short, trans people experience significant health disparities. Access to hormonal therapy and doctors competent enough to provide it, for example, remains serious issues for trans patients. 42% of trans men in one study reported experiencing verbal harassment, denial of equal treatment, or physical assault at a hospital or clinic. And a survey of OBGYNs showed that 80% received no training on trans health during their residencies, 80%. And trans people are less likely than non-trans people to have health insurance. These are all reproductive justice issues, all of which we hear far less about than the discursive inclusion of trans men in discussions about abortion. We should think about this fact as a way to think about the relationship between discourse and materiality. In short, I want to suggest that eliminating the word woman from our lexicon doesn't do the work that people on the queer political left think that it does. And further, that the demand for gender-neutral language cannot become synonymous with trans inclusion, precisely because actualizing trans justice and reproductive justice alike will demand far more from us than this simple shift in language. I am concerned that in the rush to inclusivity or gender neutrality, we have too easily ignored the structural issues, particularly those manifesting along racial, class, gender, and geographic lines that inform the experiences of the vast majority of abortive patients. Who and what is ignored in calls for language that is intentionally devoid of specificity, gendered, racial, and classed. So a few facts to help us think through this question. And some of this has already been mentioned. 75% of patients who obtain abortions are poor or low income. And Black women are 5 times and Latina women 2 times more likely to obtain abortions than white women. Furthermore, as the numbers of abortion clinics and providers shrink, patients in the South and Midwest, as well as rural areas across the US, are forced to travel farther for abortions. Clearly, who gets abortions and how they get them is racialized and classed and shaped by location. And therefore, restrictions on abortion exacerbate forms of oppression that transpire along racial, class, and geographic lines. These facts are so well established that the centrality of race, class, and geography to the US abortion story is rarely disputed among those of us fighting for reproductive justice. But when the language of queering reproductive justice appears, these facts, along with the gendered aspects of abortion, get ignored. What appears instead is a universal subject. Core to feminist, queer, trans, Black, and ethnic studies, and many related activist struggles, is the belief that the concept of a universal subject is not only ludicrous, but dangerous. All people are not equally likely to own a boat, be sexually assaulted, work jobs that pay a living wage, take vacations, own a home, die in police custody, or have an abortion. Our ability to access these things and our proximity to risks associated with these things are mediated by social factors. It is for this reason that scholars work against universalizing tendencies, suggesting that the differences between us or among us are just as important as the similarities, which often get exaggerated. Ignoring this fact is precisely what allows meritocracy and bootstrap ideology to persist, or the ideas that we are individually responsible for our successes as well as our challenges and failures. So what does any of this have to do with the future? The future of RJ, queer theory, queer approaches to RJ? Queer theory, and especially queer of color critique, contains a robust utopian vein. In this moment, we can use scholarship to retain our belief, as Loretta encouraged in her opening remarks, in the fact that what we are doing is significant. Queer of color critique can inspire the optimism that can keep us going. Optimism here should not be read as naivete. As feminist and queer theorist Lauren Berlant notes, optimism does not always feel optimistic. Second, the future of queer RJ demands that we refuse the language of queerness when what we are really and only talking about is LGBT plus people reproducing, especially because of the ways that this move often reproduces racism, classism, and sexism. The future of RJ also requires that we develop the capacities to make distinctions between the roots and ramifications of social problems. That is, misogyny and sexism are the root of anti-abortion sentiment and policy. But that doesn't mean the ramifications will be limited to women. We must be able to make these distinctions so that we can better identify political strategies. Lastly, I'm thinking about the future of doing this kind of work. And I see collaboration as central to feminist and queer approaches. I haven't talked here about crisis pregnancy centers, but this is a topic that I've been working on for nearly 25 years. And what I just want to say briefly about this is that crisis pregnancy centers target Black women and communities in ways that mirror anti-abortion strategies more broadly. I'm thinking of the billboards that say the most dangerous place for Black children is in the womb, right? At a thrift store that funds crisis pregnancy centers that I was recently at in Denton, Texas, not to buy things for research, just to be clear, I do not go there as a customer. There was not a Black worker or volunteer or shopper around, or even an image of a Black Jesus. But the sole baby doll in the high chair placed next to their promotional materials / propaganda was a Black baby doll. There is a lot more to say about race, racism, and crisis pregnancy centers, most of which has not been explored in scholarship yet. And I mention this here just to say that I'd be delighted to collaborate with folks here on crisis pregnancy centers and their racial implications, and also with those who are interested in identifying and actualizing queer approaches to reproductive justice that don't reproduce racism and sexism. The capacities of queer politics are robust, but as Kathy Cohen argued almost 30 years ago now, its potential has yet to be realized. And this is especially true in moments where discourses of queerness are being brought to bear on reproductive justice. But the increased discourses in circulation that tether reproduction to queerness mean that we have ample opportunities to do the future of queer RJ differently. Thank you.